Okay, so we have covered the differences between the North and the South, and we know that these differences are in some way going to lead to Americans fighting Americans in the American Civil War. And one of the major issues that we talked about was slavery, and it is such a hot topic because it is an emotional topic. It was an emotional topic then, and it certainly is an emotional topic now. But what's interesting about the topic of slavery is that slavery wasn't always as big of an issue in the United States of America as it was at the start of the Civil War. So I want to talk about that real quick. If you take a look up at the timeline at the top, you can see that the Revolutionary War ends in 1783. That's when the United States of America becomes a country. And over the next 78 years, our country grows from 13 states to 33 states. And unfortunately, in 1861, that's when our Civil War will begin. Well, it's not only our United States of America that's growing during that time period. I want to talk about something else that's growing during that time period. One thing that's growing is cotton production. If you take a look at this graph that I'm about to show you, I'm just showing you the title right now. It says cotton production from the year 1800, which is essentially right after the Revolutionary War, to the year 1860, which is pretty much when the Civil War is beginning. And this graph is going to show you how much cotton, how much the cash crop cotton was grown in the United States of America during this time. So take a look at this graph here, just kind of soak it in for a minute. You can see that in the year 1800, almost no cotton was grown in our country. And then you can see that within 60 years, we have gone from almost no cotton grown to almost 4 million bales of cotton grown. And that's a huge increase in just 60 years. Now, I'm not going to talk to you about why it went up so quickly, but I do want to talk to you real quick about why almost no cotton was grown in the year 1800, and really even before that. Even when the colonists came and settled in the southern colonies, they tried to grow cotton, but it didn't really work out as a cash crop, and here's why. When cotton is grown, now cotton could grow really well in the South. The soil was perfect for growing cotton. The weather was perfect for growing cotton. But what they figured out pretty quickly was when cotton grows, inside what you picture as that white, soft, fluffy, cottony stuff are these sharp, sticky seeds inside of that white, fluffy cotton. And so in order to sell the cotton to be used to make things like blankets and clothing, those sharp, sticky seeds need to be removed. Well, for a long time, the only way to remove those sharp, sticky seeds was by hand, one by one by one. And of course, this would have been done by the slaves, but it would have been a very time-consuming task, and time is money. So what plantation owners figured out really quickly was it's just too expensive to grow cotton and then turn the cotton into something that could be useful. And so for a very long time, nobody in America grew cotton. Well, clearly that had to have changed because we go from growing almost no cotton to growing a ton of cotton. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But what I want to show you is how cotton production is linked to slavery. You can see this next graph that I'm going to show you shows how slavery looked in the year 1800 in the United States of America compared to just 60 years later in 1860 at the start of the Civil War. Take a look at this graph. Now, this bar graph compares how many slaves we had in the year 1800, which if you look at the y-axis there, you can see it's less than 1 million slaves, maybe closer to 750 to 800,000 slaves in the United States of America in 1800. And you can see by 1860, that number has grown tremendously. We're almost at 4 million slaves in our country. And you can see there's a clear correlation between cotton production growing and slavery increasing. So let's kind of talk about why that happened. It really all happened because of this guy, Eli Whitney. Now, Eli Whitney was a teacher from Massachusetts. And unlike myself, as a teacher, Eli Whitney really didn't want to be a teacher. He was more passionate about being an inventor. But his problem was he couldn't come up with any good ideas for inventing something until he went down to visit a friend who owned a plantation down in Georgia. And when he was visiting this plantation with this friend, they had a discussion about why in the world she isn't growing cotton on her plantation. And she explained the problem with those sticky seeds needing to be pulled out of the cotton. And that's when the light bulb went off for Eli Whitney. He now had an idea for an invention. And that invention was called the cotton gin. Now, gin stood for engine. So the cotton gin was invented in 1793. And if you think about what you might believe this cotton gin did, if you think about the problem, you might think about his solution with this invention. The problem was it took so much time to get those sharp, sticky seeds out of the cotton by hand. So obviously, this machine is going to take those sharp, sticky seeds out for the slaves. Now, if you take a look at the year 1793, that should be almost a direct connection to those graphs that I showed you. It's around the year 1800. And so pretty much right when Eli Whitney's cotton gin was invented, that's when the amount of cotton grown in our country skyrocketed. And right as the growth of cotton is skyrocketing, at the same time, slavery is increasing. And a lot of my previous students have always thought, well, if the machine is doing the work of the slaves, shouldn't the need for slaves decrease? But let's remember that the cotton gin only does one job, and that is taking the seeds out of the cotton. Now we are growing more and more cotton, which is going to require more and more slaves to plant the cotton plant. It's going to require more and more slaves to tend to the cotton harvest. It's going to take more and more slaves as we're producing 4 million bales of cotton in the United States. It's going to require more and more slaves to pick the cotton, and of course, some to run the cotton gin. So because we're growing more cotton, we're going to need more and more slaves. And so this cotton gin invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, if we kind of follow the pathway, the cotton gin removed the seeds from the cotton so much faster than the slaves could do it. And so now Southerners can grow more cotton to make more money. It's all about the cash crops, the money-making crops. So now more cotton was being able to be sold to the north, where the factories are, and of course to Europe, where the factories are. And because of this, the need for slaves increased. And if you look here back at our timeline, the invention of the cotton gin pretty much at the start of our United States of America, in very short amount of time, you can see slavery increase dramatically to having almost 4 million slaves. And so if you think about it, we had less than 1 million slaves in the year 1800. I'm not sure if less than 1 million slaves would have made slavery as huge of an issue in our country as it was in 1860 when we're up to 4 million slaves. Now slavery is a hot topic. Now slavery is a major issue, and it's going to come to the attention of many. Now, interesting statistic though, while we're up to 4 million slaves, I just thought this was interesting. What percent of Southerners do you believe owned slaves? Make a prediction in your mind. Percent means out of 100. What percent of people living in the South do you think owned slaves? Well, here's a pie graph for you. If you look at it carefully, I know the font is tough to read, 75% of people living in the South owned not a single slave. I think that surprised a lot of you. I know that surprised me. That means only 25% of people living in the South were slave owners. And if you take a look, only 3% owned more than 20 slaves. And so obviously the richer you are, the bigger the plantation you have, the bigger the plantation you have, the more slaves you'll need. And so it's really the wealthiest plantation owners down in the South that were the majority of our slave holders. And so if you think about this, yes, slavery is a major issue of the Civil War, without a doubt. But only 25% of people in the South owned slaves. Yet those 75% that didn't own slaves are part of this as well. And so we will learn a lot about all of the people living in the South, regardless of whether they own slaves or not, and their feelings about slavery.